My name is Emily Thompson, and I'm 28 years old. A few months ago, I decided to leave the busy life of New York City and rent a small farmhouse in the countryside. I needed a break from the noise, the crowds, and everything else that came with living in the city. When I found the farmhouse online, it seemed perfect. It was quiet, peaceful, and far away from anyone. Just what I needed. The farmhouse was old, but I didn't mind. I liked the charm of it, wooden floors that creaked, the smell of old timber, and the way the wind would gently shake the windows at night. It had been standing for over a century, with history etched into its walls. I figured the place just had character. That's what I told myself when the strange things started happening. At first, it was little things. I would hear creaking sounds late at night, but the farmhouse was old, so I didn't think much of it. Then, I began hearing footsteps. It was always around midnight, slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the attic above me. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination or maybe the house settling, but as the nights went on, the sounds became harder to ignore. The attic, according to the landlord, was supposed to be empty. Just some old boxes up there, he'd said when I asked. But I was hearing things, real things. I could feel the weight of each step, the way it pressed against the ceiling, directly above my bedroom. One night, I couldn't sleep. The footsteps started again, louder this time. My heart raced. I stared at the ceiling, frozen in place, listening. Whoever, or whatever, was up there was pacing back and forth, for what felt like hours. I finally worked up the courage to go check. Grabbing a flashlight, I tiptoed toward the attic door at the end of the hallway. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. I hesitated, listening again. Silence. Maybe I was losing it. But no, I had to know. The door creaked as I opened it, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading up to the attic. I stepped onto the first step, and it groaned under my weight. Slowly, I climbed, one step at a time, until I reached the top. The attic was dark and smelled musty, just as I'd expected. My flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing dust-covered boxes and old furniture. But something felt off. There was a draft, a slight breeze coming from the far corner of the attic, where a pile of old blankets and debris lay. I walked closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. As I got nearer, I realized there was a hidden door behind the pile. My stomach turned. I moved the debris aside, revealing a small, almost invisible door built into the wall. It looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. I don't know why I opened it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else. But I turned the old brass knob and pushed it open. The door creaked loudly, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I stepped inside. The room was small, and the air was thick with dust. But what caught my attention were the photographs. Hundreds of them, pinned to the walls. Black and white photos of women, some smiling, some looking scared. They were all different ages, but there was something they all had in common. They were all taken here, in this farmhouse. My heart pounded as I realized what I was looking at. These women, whoever they were, had been here, in the attic. I stepped closer, examining the photos, and noticed a name scrawled on the back of one. It was hard to make out, but it looked like Sarah. Then I found another. Molly. I backed away, my skin crawling. Who took these pictures? Why were they hidden up here? My mind raced, piecing together the story. The previous owner had been a recluse, living alone on the farm for years before he died. No one knew much about him, just that he kept to himself. But now, I was starting to understand. He had abducted these women, kept them here, and no one ever knew. I turned to leave, panic rising, when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Someone was coming up. I hid behind a stack of boxes, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, just like the ones I'd heard before. The attic door creaked open, and I peeked out, expecting to see a stranger. But it wasn't. It was the caretaker, an older man who lived nearby, supposedly taking care of the property. He stepped inside, looking around, and muttered to himself, "She found it." I froze. He knew. He'd been helping cover up the crimes, and now he was here to make sure I never left. I didn't wait. As soon as he turned his back, I bolted down the stairs, out of the house, and into my car. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I called the police. The farm was shut down, but they never caught the caretaker. No one ever figured out how many women had disappeared there, but I knew, and I got out just in time. My name is Jason Miller, and I'm 35 years old. A few months ago, my wife Sarah and I made the decision to leave our hectic city lives behind and start fresh on a farm. We'd always dreamed of a quieter life, away from the noise and chaos of the city. So when we found an old, run-down farm for sale in rural Pennsylvania, it seemed like fate. The place needed a lot of work, but we didn't mind. We were excited about the idea of fixing it up and making it our own. The farmhouse had character, with its peeling paint, creaky floors, and an overgrown field out back. It was peaceful. Or so I thought. On the first day of exploring the property, I came across an old well hidden behind some bushes. It was covered with a rusty metal grate that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. Something about it made me feel uneasy. I don't know why. I'd seen plenty of old wells before, but this one, it just felt wrong. I mentioned it to Sarah, but she shrugged it off. "It's just an old well, Jason," she said, laughing. "You're probably just creeped out because it looks so neglected." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. There was something off about that well, something that made my skin crawl whenever I got too close. I decided to avoid it and focus on fixing up the house instead. A few days later, Sarah started acting strange. At first, it was little things. She seemed distracted, distant, and sometimes I'd catch her staring out the window, looking toward the well. When I asked her what was wrong, she'd say she was just tired from all the work. Then, one night, she woke me up in the middle of the night. "Jason," she whispered, "do you hear that?" "Hear what?" I mumbled, half asleep. "The voices. They're coming from the well." I sat up, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I hear them. They're calling me." I figured she was just exhausted from the stress of moving and renovating, so I told her it was nothing. "It's probably just the wind," I said, trying to calm her down. She didn't seem convinced, but eventually she went back to sleep. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Sarah became more obsessed with the well. She'd spend hours just standing by it, staring down at the rusty grate. When I asked her why, she'd just say, "They want me to come." I was starting to get really worried. It wasn't like her to act this way. I tried to talk to her about it, but she'd just brush me off, saying I wouldn't understand. I thought about taking her to see a doctor, but I didn't want to overreact. I figured she was just stressed and that it would pass. Then, one morning, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty. Panic shot through me, and I immediately knew where she was. I ran outside, my heart pounding, and there she was, standing by the well, barefoot in her nightgown, hands gripping the metal grate. "Sarah," I shouted, racing toward her. She didn't respond. She just kept staring down into the well, her face pale and blank. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "They want me to come," she whispered, her voice eerily calm. "They're waiting for me." I grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the edge. "No, you're not going anywhere." She resisted at first, but eventually she came to her senses, blinking as if she was waking up from a bad dream. She looked at me, confused. "Jason, what's happening to me?" I didn't have an answer, but I knew I had to get to the bottom of whatever was going on. I couldn't just ignore it anymore. That afternoon, I went back to the well, determined to see what was inside. I grabbed a crowbar from the shed and pried the rusty grate open. The metal groaned as I lifted it, and a foul stench wafted up from the darkness below. Shining a flashlight down into the well, I froze. At the bottom, I could see bones, human bones. There were several skeletons, their remains tangled together in a mass of decay. My stomach turned as I realized what I was looking at. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, they pulled up the remains, and the truth came out. The previous owner of the farm had been a disturbed man. Years ago, he'd murdered his entire family, his wife and 2 daughters, and thrown their bodies into the well before taking his own life in the house. The farm had been abandoned ever since. Sarah was shaken by what we'd found, but at least now we understood what had been haunting her. The voices she'd heard were the echoes of those poor souls trapped in the well. We packed up that same day and left the farm, vowing never to return. My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. A few months ago, I inherited my late uncle's farm in a quiet, remote part of Michigan. I hadn't visited him much in his later years, and when I heard of his passing, it felt surreal. Moving into the old farmhouse was my way of starting fresh, leaving the past behind, and figuring out what to do with my life. The place was peaceful, a little rundown, but manageable, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had space to breathe. The farmhouse had a charm to it, creaky wooden floors, antique furniture, and the smell of old wood and earth. I spent the first week cleaning and organizing, sorting through my uncle's belongings. He'd lived alone for years, and there were boxes of papers, photographs, and letters scattered throughout the house. As I settled in, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling of unease. I didn't know much about my uncle's life or his friends. The farm felt isolated, too quiet at night, and there was something unsettling about being there alone. One evening, just as the sun was setting, I heard a knock on the door. Startled, I hesitated before opening it. Standing there was a man, disheveled, with wild, graying hair and clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in days. He was thin, his eyes sunken and darting around nervously. "Evening," he said in a rough voice. "I'm an old friend of your uncle's. Name's Tom. I was just passing through, figured I'd stop by. Is it all right if I stay the night? Roads are dangerous this time of year, and I'm not sure how far I can get." I didn't know what to say. Something about him made me feel uneasy, but I didn't want to be rude. He could have been telling the truth, and the idea of turning away one of my uncle's friends felt wrong. Against my better judgment, I nodded slowly. "Sure, I have a spare room upstairs." He thanked me and stepped inside. As the night went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Tom hardly spoke, just kept to himself, sipping water and glancing around the room like he was searching for something. I tried to make small talk, asking about his connection to my uncle, but his answers were vague. "We go way back," was all he said, offering no further details. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind outside, seemed louder. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate. They weren't coming from upstairs, where Tom was supposed to be sleeping. They were coming from the office, down the hall. Heart pounding, I quietly got out of bed and crept toward the noise. The door to my uncle's office was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see Tom inside, rifling through the desk drawers. Papers were scattered across the floor, and he was frantically searching for something. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping into the room. Tom froze, his eyes wide with shock. Then his expression darkened. "Your uncle owed me something," he said slowly, almost threateningly. "I'm just here to collect what's mine." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What are you talking about?" "He had something valuable, Something that belonged to me, Tom muttered, his hands shaking as he continued to sift through the papers. He thought he could hide it, but I know it's here. Fear twisted in my gut. I didn't know what Tom was looking for, but I knew I needed to get out of that house. Slowly, I backed away, trying to stay calm. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you should leave. Tom's eyes flicked to me, cold and calculating. I'm not leaving without it. Without another word, I turned and ran. My heart was racing as I grabbed my phone and called the police. I locked myself in my bedroom, trying to keep quiet, praying they'd get here fast enough. Every second felt like an eternity. When the police arrived, they found Tom still in the office, rummaging through my uncle's things. But what they told me afterward was even more horrifying. Tom wasn't just some old friend of my uncle's. He was a wanted murderer. Years ago, he had killed several people, including my uncle. The police had been searching for him for years, but he had vanished without a trace. He must have returned to the farm, thinking my uncle had hidden something valuable from him. I couldn't believe it. The man who had killed my uncle had been standing in my home, looking for whatever it was he thought he was owed. I was lucky to have gotten out unharmed. The next day, I packed my things and left the farm for good. I never looked back.